Good day. The news from the battlefields in Donbass continues much in the same direction that it's been doing for the last couple of weeks. There's incremental Russian advances. Russian troops are now said to be just 7 kilometers from the key town of Bakhmut, Artemyevsk as they call it, which is the main base area for Ukrainian forces in northern Donbass. And there's reports that the Ukrainian troops at the Azot chemical works are now completely encircled. So supposedly about 2,500 of them there. And there's also further reports of further Russian advances, incremental advances towards Slavyansk. The assumption, the universal assumption, is that the Russians will sort out the northern Donbass first, Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, which is now also increasingly under threat of ever tighter encirclement, Bakhmut, and then, once they've done that, they will move on to Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, and once those are sorted out, the front lines behind opposite Donetsk, the city of Donetsk, where most of the shelling is taking place. The assumption is that that's the point when the Ukrainian troops opposite Donetsk will either be forced to retreat or be encircled in turn, and then the Battle of Donbass will be over. The main battles, in other words, are taking place in northern Donbass, in the Severodonetsk, Lysychansk conurbation, in Bakhmut, and in Slavyansk, Kramatorsk. And the wide assumption is once these towns are captured, once the Ukrainian troops that are stationed there have been forced to surrender, then the Battle of Donbass will essentially be over. And then, of course, the assumption further is that the Russians will have further options to decide what they would want to do beyond these battles in Donbass. Now, there's been much discussion about the geography of the area. There's explanations from various people on different sides that this area, Donbass, is actually quite heavily built up, even though it's actually very large, but it's comparable in some respects to the Ruhr in Germany. It's an area of small cities and towns, but heavily industrialized, a legacy of the Soviet era. It was one of the major industrial heartlands, both of the Russian Empire and of the Soviet Union. So there's a large number of industrial towns and factories, all closely linked up with each other. The entire area is heavily built up, and that makes it ideal for defense. And it's been suggested that this geography does not reproduce itself across the rest of Ukraine. There are areas of Ukraine which are more difficult for an attacker and more helpful to a defender than others, but none that produce the peculiar geography of Donbass. So once Donbass is fully pacified or occupied by the Russians, once they've cleared the Ukrainian troops fully of Donbass, the major area, the major shield for the Ukrainians that Donbass provides, the major defensive shield, will have gone, and the Russians will be in a stronger position to advance elsewhere. And of course, on top of that, the further assumption is that with the best Ukrainian troops in Donbass, with troops in Donbass being supplied or disproportionately with the weapon systems that the West is providing, that with the best of Ukraine's army in Donbass destroyed, that will open the way for the Russians to advance in other places. Now, that is the analysis which I have adopted, which I have followed since pretty much the start of the war. It's also the analysis that you will find in Russian commentaries about the war, that the critical battle, the key battle for Ukraine, is the battle in Donbass. I should say, in parenthesis, that in the West it's slightly different. The assumption there, and I'm just reading a piece about this in the New York Times, is that the Russians will continue to gain ground in Donbass, but they will never be able to capture all of it, or they won't be able to capture the whole of eastern Ukraine, however that is defined geographically. It's a good question, what is eastern Ukraine, and that some kind of a stalemate will be achieved thereby, and that even if Donbass falls, the war will grind on for a long time. And this is something, by the way, that Western governments and Western publics are not prepared for. It represents a change from what they were being told a few weeks and months ago. I will come to that later in the program and what the implications of that are. But I still myself hold to my original view. I'm not, as I've said many times, a military person, but I cannot myself see how Ukraine will be able to continue the war indefinitely or on a protracted basis when the best part of its army in Donbass has been destroyed, when it's lost its key economic and industrial base, and with the Russians in control of much of the industrial and agricultural heartland, economic heartland of Ukraine. I would have thought, on the contrary, that once Ukrainian resistance in Donbass is broken, and I don't think anybody any longer really doubts that in time it will be, at that point my own view is that Ukraine will find it increasingly difficult to sustain the war, whatever support it continues to get from the West. Anyway, I've just summed up the military situation. There are further points to say. Ukraine is now becoming increasingly alarmed about the situation around Kharkiv. The Russians have been advancing steadily to the outskirts of Kharkiv city. Ukrainian officials are now talking about a renewed Russian offensive in Kharkiv. I don't think that the Russians have any plan to storm Kharkiv or Zaporozhye or Dnipro or any other major populated center until the Battle of Donbass is over. I come back to what I have said right from the start of this war. The Russians continue to follow the kind of strategy that was outlined by Clausewitz all those years ago, back in the 1820s and 1830s. Their priority is the destruction of the enemy's army, of his will to resist, and for them that is going to be achieved by destroying the Ukrainian forces in in Donbass. Kharkiv, Zaporozhye, Dnipropetrovsk, Nikolaev, Odessa, Kiev as well, if their ambitions really do extend that far. All of these can wait. The battle in Donbass has to be won first. Now, I'm going to make a number of further observations about the course of the struggle. I've made these observations before, but I'm going to repeat them. The first is that Russia is fighting the war in Donbass with an expeditionary force which derives from what remains very much a peacetime army and a peacetime military establishment. There's been lots of comments, discussions, proposals, suggestions that Russia mobilize its armed forces, its entire armed forces, that it starts calling up reservists, that it transfer its industries onto a wartime basis. The Russians are doing none of those things. They're continuing to wage the war in Donbass with essentially the army that they started the war with. And I'm going to say something else. I've been following events in Donbass very, very closely indeed. And my very strong, in fact growing impression is that at any particular point in time, only a small proportion of the Russian army, of the Russian expeditionary force in Donbass, is actually engaged in actual battle. Most of the street fighting that you hear about in these towns that are taking place. Most of the actual battles in the streets are actually conducted by militia from the two republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republic. There is a rationale for this. The Donbass is what they claim to be their national territory. The people in these towns and cities, Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, Bakhmut, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, they are all people who the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics claim as their citizens. So it makes logical sense to use these militia forces disproportionately to try to carry out the street fighting in these towns. And whilst I'm on the subject of the street fighting, I should say that it is not as intensive in terms of casualties for the militia as one might think, because the way in which the Russians are conducting this war, with heavy use of artillery, increasing use of drones, identification and separation of Ukrainian forces, and with those same Ukrainian forces increasingly demoralized, short of equipment, it's becoming increasingly clear that the street fighting goes very quickly in favor of the militias and the other troops that engage in this street fighting when it actually begins. In other words, the Russians don't rush into these towns. They prepare them, they soften them up carefully before they actually send infantry to take them. And we've been seeing how this works. We saw that in Liman, Krasny Liman, as the Russians and the two republics have now renamed it. The Ukrainian forces collapsed very quickly. There was very little resistance in Liman when the militia forces and the Russians actually entered that town. The same proved true in Svyatogorsk, and by the way, it's also proved to be true in Severodonetsk as well. What happened was when the infantry entered Severodonetsk, Ukrainian resistance collapsed. The local garrison fled, and it looked as if a collapse was about to happen until the Ukrainian authorities rushed some of their best troops to Severodonetsk in order to prevent that collapse from turning into a total rout. And that was what led to those stories a few weeks ago about a successful Ukrainian counteroffensive in Severodonetsk. It was all connected with the arrival of these reinforcements, these hurried reinforcements to prevent a collapse in the town, except of course that those reinforcements were then pushed back and isolated in the Azot chemical works, where they still are, allegedly 2,500 of them. And it seems these troops at the Azot chemical works include some of Ukraine's special forces and a legion of largely Georgian volunteers who are assumed to be highly motivated, but who have been in effect thrown away defending a town, Severodonetsk, which to my mind is undefendable. So the Ukrainians have done what they did in Mariupol. They're protracting the fight in Severodonetsk, or rather they're pretending that they're protracting the fight in Severodonetsk. As I've said many times, the city itself is fully occupied by the Russians. The only area which is still held by Ukraine is the Azot chemical works. But just as was the case with the Azovstal steel works in Mariupol, so with the Azot chemical works in Severodonetsk, Ukraine, because they're clinging on to these factories on the outskirts of these cities, they pretend or they claim that they're still holding on to these cities in some form. It's an extraordinarily expensive, massively wasteful misuse of resources, human resources, in my opinion, pretending to control cities or to retain control of cities, even whilst, in fact, you've actually been pushed out of them. And it involves throwing away some of Ukraine's best and most motivated troops. The Azov regiment in Mariupol, which has been all but destroyed, and now these elite troops in Severodonetsk as well. And with Lysychansk apparently now close to total encirclement, one can see, to my mind, the military folly and the human folly of these kind of tactics. So that is what has happened in Severodonetsk. But coming back to what I was originally saying, it's becoming increasingly clear that the street fighting, when it does start, actually does not involve the very heavy casualties that one might have expected earlier in the war. Before the Russians attack urban areas, they make sure that they will fall quickly. And that brings me back to my further point, because my overwhelming impression is that the greater part of the Russian forces in Donbass, in Ukraine, are being held back. They're not actually being engaged in the battle. What happens is that particular Russian military formations are briefly brought to the front lines. They are that way blooded, they're given experience in battle, and then after a day or so they're rotated away and taken back to the reserve. And this is something that goes on continuously. There's a kind of churn so that the soldiers and officers of these units gradually gain experience of battle without suffering significant losses. And of course, they're also getting increasingly more reinforcement. And I've noticed that over the last few days, there's more reports of more advanced tanks, T80 tanks, being increasingly deployed in the battles in Donbass. Now, if you take your mind back a couple of weeks, there was all that talk about Russia dusting out old, obsolete T-62 tanks from the 1960s and bringing them to the battlefields because supposedly Russia was running out of tanks. Well, there was an awful lot said about that story at one time, but if you remember, it's all now melted away. There's not been much sign of these decrepit T-62s anywhere on the actual battlefields. I think that whole story, by the way, was a hoax, and Jacob Dreisen in the Dreisen report also said so and provided some information showing that it was. In fact, the tanks that are being increasingly brought to the battlefield are increasingly modern tanks. At the outset of the war, the Russians were using rather older tanks, older versions of the T-72 tank, which is the main tank of the Russian army, but they're gradually being replaced by more modern T-72s, by some T-90 tanks, which are the most modern tanks in the Russian army, but also, and perhaps most interestingly, T80 tanks. Now, the T80 tanks are a modernized version of a tank developed by the Soviet Union. It's unusual in that it has a gas turbine engine. This is apparently proved extremely useful in built-up areas where the gas turbine engine is very quiet, and it gives the tank great nimbleness. It can move and maneuver around in an urban landscape extremely effectively. But the other thing about the T80 tank is that it's designed to be a breakthrough tank. The idea is that once the front lines are broken, you can advance rapidly with this gas turbine engine. T80 tanks, when they move fast, can move extremely fast. There's even a story that during the later years of the Cold War, a unit of T80s found itself on a German autobahn and actually overtook some of the road traffic, to the astonishment of the German drivers. This has been one of the autobahns, West German autobahns, from West Germany, the then West Germany, to Berlin. Anyway, so this is a tank that can move extremely fast. It uses up an awful lot of fuel, but as I said, it can move very fast for short periods, and it's the kind of tank that the Soviets designed to exploit breakthroughs. You pour in these tanks quickly, and they move and capture ground fast in the enemy's rear. So maybe that's what these increasing deployments of T80 tanks are for, or maybe the Russians are capitalizing on the T80's proven successes in street fighting. By the way, just as a historical point, the success of the T80 in street fighting in the Donbass, to my mind, has finally and forever buried a persistent myth that the Russian army withdrew the T80 tank from its arsenal because supposedly the T80 tank proved a failure in the street fighting in Grozny during the First Chechen War. That story is simply not correct. It's a story that was spread following the First Chechen War in the media. The reason it was withdrawn from service was because the gas turbine engine was so fuel expensive that it was difficult to keep that tank operating. In today's Russia, that problem doesn't exist. In the 90s it did, but in today's Russia, it's no longer a problem. And the result is that the T80s have been recently modernized, extensively modernized, and have been increasingly coming back into service. I just wanted to say that as a particular point. Anyway, that's where we are in the battle. We see that increasingly, as I said, the Russians are closing in on all of these places. We hear more reports about Ukrainian troops becoming increasingly demoralized. Some of them are refusing to fight places, and it's an incremental battle because this is such a heavily urbanized environment. Once the Russians have broken through in Donbass, as they're increasingly close to getting, then one gets the sense that perhaps we will see more dynamic battles going forward. Now, the other side, the Ukrainians, are not being idle either. And what has happened as well is that there's been increasing amounts of artillery shelling of Donetsk. And there was that extremely strange or disturbing episode of the Ukrainian attacks on the oil facilities in the Black Sea off the coast of Crimea. Now, what's becoming increasingly evident is that the Ukrainians are increasingly using some of this Western artillery they've been provided with in order to shell Donetsk. In other words, they're not sending some of these advanced, well, I don't know how advanced they are, some of these howitzers and self-propelled guns the West has been supplying to them. They're not sending them to the front lines in northern Donbass. They seem to be sending them instead to areas opposite Donetsk, and they've, as a result, intensified their shelling of Donetsk, even though there doesn't seem to be much military logic to this. Well, it seems to me that what they're increasingly doing is that they're trying to get the Russians to refocus troops to the Donetsk front lines, to the front line outside Donetsk city, to take on these Ukrainian forces in these heavily fortified areas opposite Donetsk, thereby relieving pressure on the Ukrainian troops in northern Donbass. And as I think I discussed in my previous video, the Russians are not being drawn to this. They're absorbing the shelling of Donetsk. They're sending more artillery to Donetsk to engage in counter artillery fire against these Ukrainian guns. And of course, no doubt Russian Air Force is also doing whatever it can. But the focus remains for the Russians on northern Donbass. And Putin basically said in a Q&A at the SPIEF conference in St. Petersburg that once northern Donbass is, the problems there are, the battle there is won, then the Russians intend to attack these Ukrainian troops who have been shelling Donetsk from the rear. Now, that attack on the oil installations in the Black Sea, it seems, was a sequel to a further failed Ukrainian attack against Snake Island. Snake Island is this island off the coast of Odessa, which the Russians captured right at the start of the war. It's now become increasingly heavily fortified. In early May, the Ukrainians tried disastrously to recapture it. Their attempt to do so ended in a major debacle, but the Ukrainians have been trying to make attacks on it ever since, and they made a major attack on it the day before yesterday. They didn't actually send Marines to try and retake it, but they launched artillery and missile strikes against Snake Island, but it seems that the missiles failed to get through. And at some point, someone in Ukraine seems to have made a decision that if this attack on Snake Island wasn't going to work, then Ukraine should instead attack these oil installations. And that has, of course, annoyed the Russians to an extreme degree. And of course, it's now triggered discussion about possible Russian retaliation. Now, there's been much talk about attacks on command centers, Russian attacks on command centers in Ukraine. The Russians have previously warned that they have not done so up to now, but if there are attacks on Russian territory, sustained attack on Russian territory, then they will retaliate by attacking these command centers. And shortly after these attacks on the oil installations, the Ukrainians spread stories about an overwhelming Russian missile strike, counterattack, possibly on the command centers in Kiev. Now, I've previously said that I think that these warnings about attacks on Russian territory, which would provoke attacks on Ukrainian command centers, was specifically about Crimea. They were specifically intended to warn Ukraine about attacks on Crimea. And these oil installations were in Crimean waters and could be said to be in Crimea. And it's possible that we will indeed be seeing Russian missile strikes in retaliation. But again, it's interesting to note that the Russians never do quite what the Ukrainians are always trying to maneuver them into doing, because there was intense missile strikes from the Russians in the hours after these attacks on the oil refineries, but they appear to have been heavily focused principally on Odessa, on the place where these strikes on those oil refineries and on Snake Island came from. Maybe once the Ukrainians have decided that attacks on the Russian, on the command centers aren't coming, maybe the Ukrainians will relax, and that will be the moment when the Russians do launch these missile strikes on those command centers. I don't know, but for the moment, that hasn't happened, and I doubt personally that in the next few hours it will happen. Though I repeat again, the Russian High Command doesn't share its policies, its intentions with me. Anyway, putting all that to one side, I think one thing the attack on those refineries has done is that it has hardened Russian plans to capture Odessa. I think that the Russians are increasingly coming round to the view that so long as Ukraine retains control of Odessa, it will continue to represent a threat to Russian shipping, not just naval shipping, but also merchant shipping and oil refineries and such things on the Black Sea. And I've been reading more statements by Russians. These are, of course, not people directly connected in any way to the Russian government or to the Russian military. So, of course, they're not authoritative, but more and more of them are pointing out that Odessa, in Ukrainian hands, represents a permanent threat to Russian control over the Black Sea. And I can't help but think that this reflects an internal debate that is going on within Russia itself. I think that there's been much discussion about Odessa. I have long taken the view that it will be all but impossible for Russia to end this military operation without making some move against Odessa, without trying to bring Odessa under Russian control. And I suspect that these attacks by Ukraine from Odessa on these oil installations have tilted the argument even further towards taking control of Odessa eventually. So that's, I think, a summary of the overall military situation. I want to say a few things now about the economics of this. The first is that we've now received confirmation that China has become a major importer of Russian oil, and Russia has now overtaken Saudi Arabia as the major exporter of oil to China. Now, a few weeks ago, I remember reading all sorts of articles in the Financial Times that it was only secondary Chinese companies, oil companies, buying Russian oil. The major Chinese oil companies were avoiding Russian oil because they were worried about secondary sanctions. Well, a few weeks later, we discover that in fact Russia has now overtaken Saudi Arabia and is China's biggest oil supplier. And of course this comes on top of that telephone call between Putin and Xi Jinping that took place last week, which I discussed in a program I made last week, in which the Chinese leader basically signaled clearly his strong support for Russia and China's strong support for Russia, and the depth of their strategic partnership, and the fact that the Chinese and the Russians fully intend to press ahead with all economic cooperation. And we now saw that on Friday, President Xi Jinping of China addressed the SPIEF conference. He spoke directly after Putin. It was a virtual address. Didn't say anything very interesting or very new, but it basically did again signal China's support for Russia. The very fact that President Xi spoke at SPIEF was clearly intended to signal both to the Russians and to the world China's continued support for Russia in this kind of situation, and China's continued commitment to the strategic partnership with Russia. And I've said elsewhere that the fact that China seems to be intending to upgrade its economic links with Russia essentially means that the sanctions war that the Western powers intended to launch against Russia has failed, and it has failed utterly. The Russians possess immense scientific and technological depth. I'm confident, I'm absolutely certain, in fact, that they will be able to replace a lot of these technologies that the West has been talking about, and which it's trying to withhold from the Russians. But with the Chinese also now backing Russia, economically speaking, it's game over. Now, I say that even as we get more and more reports. They were touched on, by the way, by Putin in his speech at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum at SPIEF. Putin is aware of this, the Russians are aware of this. There's these reports now that the Americans and the Europeans are pressing forward with this plan to impose price caps on Russian oil. Now, they've never quite spelled out what this means, but I think the general idea is that the Russians will be unable to sell their oil globally above a certain price. So let's assume that the oil price generally is $120 a barrel. The Russians will not be able, or will be prevented somehow from selling oil to, say, India or China or wherever at a price higher than, let's say, $50 a barrel. I mean, I'm plucking numbers out of the air, but this is presumably some attempt to impose global price caps on Russian oil sales. Now, I say this because it's not easy to see how the Americans and the Europeans can impose price caps on oil, Russian oil, sold to themselves, because, of course, according to their sanctions, they are not, in fact, buying oil from the Russians anymore. So this is an attempt by the Western powers to interfere in commercial arrangements between the Russians and third parties. Now, I have to say, I think this is a crazy scheme. I think the idea that the Western powers can enforce price caps, it can interfere directly in trade between the Chinese and the Russians, and between India and Russia, and between Russia and other countries, is ludicrous. The Chinese and the Indians will settle their own terms of trade with the Russians, and I can't honestly see how the Western powers think that they can enforce this thing, this price cap idea. Policing it is going to be a complete nightmare. It's going to create frictions between the Chinese and the Indians and whomever and the West, and to the extent that it's successful, it's all but guaranteed to create oil shortages. Because, of course, if the Russians can't sell their oil at a commercial price, it's likely that they will withhold it. And that's what they've said they will do. So I think this is a crazy idea. Whenever attempts have been made to impose price caps on a market in goods, particularly a commodity market in goods, it invariably leads to shortages. And this, it seems to me, is a case in point. But nonetheless, apparently, the Western powers, having learnt nothing from the failure so far of their sanctions policy, are now intent on doubling down. And this is apparently what they intend to do. Now, there are increasing doubts about this as the situation economically in the West gets ever harsher. And just before I did this program, I was looking at an email that somebody sent me, a private email, about the latest figures for the rise in producer prices in Germany. And the rises in producer prices in Germany are eye-wateringly high. German inflation is going to go higher still, so is inflation across the Eurozone. And I understand that the popularity of the German government is sinking. It's now apparently polling at around 30%, and we're not even yet in winter, and things are getting worse every day. But there's been an article in Britain in the Guardian newspaper, by a journalist called Gabby Hinsliff, which I think highlights the underlying problems. Now, I should say Gabby Hinsliff is a journalist who, I think it's fair to say, takes a fairly conventional Guardian view on most issues. I don't want to say more about her. People are entitled to form whatever view they wish about her, but I certainly don't think she's somebody who could be said to be pro-Russian or pro-Putin in any conceivable way, or who has been anything less than supportive of Britain's policies with respect to Ukraine. But these are some of the things that her article says, and I would say that an article by a journalist like Gabby Hinsliff that makes these kind of points is very much an indicator of things to come. Anyway, the article begins with this headline: "Someone must tell Britain about the real cost of war in Ukraine. Does Johnson have the authority?" And then she goes on to say, "Whenever Boris Johnson is in the doghouse at home, there's one place he can always expect a warm welcome. So it is perhaps no surprise he abandoned a planned speech to restless Northern Tory MPs in favour of flying to Ukraine last week for another firm handshake with its heroic wartime leader." Yet, cynical as the timing of this particular photo opportunity looks, Johnson's warnings of the dangers of Ukraine fatigue setting in as the war grinds on was salutary and fair. What he has yet to do, however, is spell out exactly what being in it for the long haul, which could now mean years, according to NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, actually involves. The day when solidarity with Ukraine meant putting a blue and yellow flag on your social media profile and watching TikToks of farmers merrily stealing Russian tanks are over. Britain is not strictly at war, but ours is now a wartime economy. The country has entered a new and unfamiliar form of conflict, which does not risk the lives of British soldiers, but effectively puts our economic well-being on the front line instead. Withstanding the economic storm now buffeting us as war pushes the price of both oil and wheat ever higher, is the contribution most ordinary Britons didn't quite realise we were going to be making to the war effort. Life is already tough for millions thanks to the soaring fuel and food prices, which has driven up what would have been rocketing inflation anyway, caused globally by countries roaring back to life post-pandemic. But it's going to get tougher when the weather gets cold enough to put the central heating on. And then she goes on to discuss various things about the state of the war and things of this kind, and about what the chief of the British Army is saying. But then she goes back to the economic situation. An autumn of strikes, and we're in the middle of a rail strike in Britain as I'm speaking, and paid-for public sector pay negotiations meanwhile looms as squeezed workers understandably push for pay rises. Lecturing people on the need for restraint may work if this is a temporary blip, But what if this new form of economic warfare means living with higher fuel and food costs for the longer term? Vulnerable people will obviously have to be protected, as they were in last month's emergency package, with help with fuel bills. But then she goes on to discuss whether or not that is really sustainable. And she discusses further about whether, in fact, the British government has the moral authority anyway to actually preach to the British about belt tightening, especially given the way in which Prime Minister Johnson broke his own rules during the pandemic. And then she goes on to say, finishes by saying, if Stoltenberg is right about the crisis grinding on for years, then it's something Johnson's successor will be probably grappling with too. There is no painless form of war, no matter how cold or hot it runs, nor how far away it seems. Sooner or later, someone has to level with the public about the fact that freedom only ever comes at a price. And here, I think, is the rub, because clearly Gabby Hinscliffe and The Guardian and people at The Guardian and much of the media are probably prepared to go on paying the price. But I wonder whether the British people will, if anybody ever does, level with them. To be straightforward, I doubt it. I think it is increasingly unlikely. I think Ukraine fatigue is going to take an increasing toll, and I think increasingly people are going to start demanding an end to this thing and some kind of solution. In other words, the clock is already running down. So when people talk about a prolonged war of attrition, it's a war of attrition which people are not being honest with the British people about, and indeed the public in the West about, and which I think sooner or later people in the West are going to say enough of. And we've already seen the effect of the higher inflation in France. We've seen the fall in the popularity of the German government. We've seen the rise of the brothers in Italy. We're going to see much more of that over the next few weeks and months. And if this war does continue for years, which I doubt, by the way, then we'll be seeing that for more still. Anyway, that's where we are. An improving economic picture in Russia, falling prices there, deflation in June. They probably can endure it for the long term. After all, it's a war which Russians care about and have direct skin in. We don't. Whether we can continue to sustain this over the long term in the way that people like Stoltenberg and the writers in the New York Times and some people in the Biden administration think, well, I think that is extremely unlikely. There we go. That's where we are, as it seems to me today. I'll be coming back and discussing more soon. In the meantime, so this has been a long video, I'm going to stop now. And remember, you can find us on our other platforms, Rumble and Locals, and primarily, but also Super U and ODYSEE and Telegram and other places. And you can also find us, of course, on, and you can also support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. And you can go to our shop and buy the great things you will find there. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, remember to press the like button and also to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.